Welcome, everyone, to the Herbert C. Kelman Seminar series. And we're really, really grateful that you decided to come and join us today. I think you're going to have a very interesting time hearing Matt Waldman's findings of his research, and we are really grateful to him for being here as well. First, let me say that this seminar, the Herbert C. Kelman Seminar, is co-sponsored by PON and the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, both here at Harvard. And I also want to thank my colleagues for all their help putting this together: Diane Long, Nicole Bryant, Laura Sampietro, and Lindsay Sullivan. It takes a village to pull off one of these seminars, and we've got an A-team, so thank you very much. So today, as you know, you're going to be hearing from Matt Waldman, and the title of his talk is Peacemaking is in Trouble. What Now? How to Strengthen Mediation Effectiveness in a Dangerous New Era. So let me also just say before I introduce Matt that the format of this seminar is such that Matt will present for about 35 to 40 minutes, after which we will open it up to you, the audience. But I would ask that you please put your questions in the Q&A function, and we will take them. I will moderate that. I will read them off to Matt when we get to that point. And what else? Oh, I wanted to say that this seminar is going to be recorded. So if you want to hear it again or send it on, recommend it to some friends, in a couple of days, check on the PON website, click on events, and you'll see it there. So yes, Matt Waldman, he's no stranger to the Kelman Seminar. We've had him here before, and we're grateful that he took the time to be with us again. And let me just read some information about Matt. He's an expert advisor at the European Leadership Network, a senior advisor at the European Institute of Peace, and an associate at Oxford University's Department of Politics and International Relations, specializing in the Russia-Ukraine war and China-West relations. Previously, he served as a special advisor to the UN envoys on Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, and contributing to mediation efforts across various international organizations. Matt's research on armed conflict and foreign policy making has been conducted at prestigious institutions, including Harvard Law School and the Belfer Center right here at Harvard. So, Matt, I'm going to turn this over to you, and I'm going to disappear. So there you go.
Well, Donna, thank you very much for that kind introduction and for having me back on the Kelman Seminar. So really pleased to be with you and with everyone else. I'd like to just begin by describing what I'll go through today. I'm going to give you an outline of research that I've been conducting over the past 3 or 4 years on mediation effectiveness. I'll just be giving highlights given the time constraints. I'm interested in your views, and I think really this is a collective endeavor that we all share to improve mediation effectiveness. And I think we need all of the thinking, the insights, and experience that people have to bear on this really important issue. There are 6 short elements. One, just the rationale for the research, the method that I used, the international context, 9 areas of flaws and deficiencies that emerged from the research, the changes that are needed, and finally, more of my own thoughts of what I believe is necessary, a major process of change. So then, the background briefly, as I know that you are aware, there are more armed conflicts today around the world than at any point since World War II. Civil wars especially have proliferated since 2011. And we've seen a litany of conflicts which have persisted and sometimes abated and then re-erupted, some of which I've noted there. I think this chart, which is produced by the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, is useful because it gives us a sense of what has happened in terms of armed conflict over the last 75 years or so. And one can see there very clearly the expansion of armed conflict, and especially of intrastate conflict. And you see there in pink the expansion of internationalized intrastate conflict. This slide, produced by Stina Hogblad, shows there at the bottom peace processes, partial or full peace agreements, and higher up you can see there the line which designates armed conflicts. There's a huge gap between them, of which we're all aware. And of course, we need to think beyond the lines of this graph because, of course, there are very real human implications of our inability to resolve and to prevent armed conflict. And the scale and the severity of the suffering caused was really what motivated me to conduct this research. So then the method that I used to conduct the research, it was commenced, first of all, I should say, at the program on negotiation at Harvard, where I was a fellow, and then continued at Oxford. And it really revolved around this central question of what could be done to increase the efficacy of mediation efforts to resolve and prevent armed conflict. And effectiveness was, I mean, we could spend a long time discussing what that means, but really, I think this is about making progress towards sustainable peace. I interviewed many of the world's leading peacemakers and mediation professionals. Many had United Nations experience, but there were many also who gained experience in regional organizations as well as NGOs. And I supplemented those interviews with 10 colloquia, which engaged many other practitioners and experts. I think in total it is maybe one of the largest consultations of its kind. And of course, this approach yields brushstrokes of opinion. It is not scientific evidence. It is, of course, one method of many. And of course, there's been a lot of work with data sets and with case studies, which are extremely valuable. Now, one needs to acknowledge that the experts and the practitioners are not necessarily right in the views they express, but I believe we really should take their views seriously, especially as for many of them spent decades working in this field. Now, a few remarks before I share the main findings of the research, just to say that there really was an outpouring. People really wanted to talk about this issue. They had a lot to say about this issue, about how mediation could improve. And that's partly because, of course, it was on a non-attributable basis. My question was oriented towards what needs to change. People chose to identify flaws and weaknesses and deficiencies. I think that's partly due to something known as substitution bias, but I wanted to be faithful to the emphasis that my interviewees chose to give, and that's reflected really in these findings and in the publication that followed. The research brought out the heterogeneity of mediation, that really every mediator has a different experience, a different professional experience, even if they have worked on the same or similar conflicts. There tended to be a structural emphasis that people placed in their responses. In other words, the system as a whole, rather than specific cases. That was to do with, I think, the framing of the question. And people tended to draw on their own experience. And therefore, there was quite a lot of reference to the UN, to tracks 1 and 1.5. And that's, of course, where it's connected to officials, but one stage removed. And a lot on intrastate conflict, where, of course, most of the conflicts have taken place in recent times. Most of the interviewees wanted to emphasize the difficulty of the work. We need to recognize the power of the drivers of conflict. And as one says here, it's a miracle that it sometimes works, especially in light of the limited power that mediators have. Really, in a sense, they're relying on persuasion, although there are many techniques and methods associated with the practice. Now, the interviewees wanted to note the fact that we are in an incredibly difficult international context for the mediation of armed conflict. And really looking back over the last 10, 20 years, people wanted to emphasize the complexity of operating environments, the willingness of major and regional powers to engage in civil conflict, to support sides that they want to see prevailing. And of course, that makes mediation very difficult for those reasons mentioned there on the screen. They emphasize the difficulties caused by international division and contention, including in the United Nations Security Council itself. They pointed to the lack of political will amongst leading states to really get to grips with armed conflict. Of course, mediation tends to be associated with the liberal West, and the fact that the West has been seen to decline, that its democracy that the West itself doesn't always abide by the principles and standards it says should be applied to democracies. And of course, very substantiated allegations of double standards in international affairs. That's seen as sort of undermining the legitimacy, the credibility of the overall liberal project of which mediation is seen as being a part. The misuse of mediation to advance state interests is really seen as some states seen as using mediation for their own advantage, again, sort of undermining that legitimacy. And the attenuation of mediation efforts, this sense that the parties can easily walk away from them in ways which wouldn't have been so possible in the past. And then just before I talk about specific areas, the overall sense of how mediation was doing amongst interviewees and colloquia participants. Well, I think it's fair to say that there is agreement that the field is in trouble, that in different ways it is failing to deliver. Some even talk about it being in crisis, although not all. And partly that's ascribed to the factors that I just mentioned, the very difficult context that mediation has been operating in. But the fact that mediation hasn't yet really fully adapted to that new context, that somehow it's operating on the basis of outdated assumptions or methods that don't quite work anymore. There is also the view that the inability to achieve success is due to endogenous factors. Of course, in this case, that really refers to flaws and deficiencies within the field of mediation, the systems, structures, policies, and practices. And one could say, and that would be my sense of having done this research, that in many respects, the field isn't getting the fundamentals right. Now, the discourse on mediation does consider adaptation and innovation, but the fundamentals, curiously, are not so widely discussed or addressed. Now, as I read it from the work that I did going through all of my interviews and the transcripts of the colloquia, I think that you can identify 9 main areas where there were flaws and deficiencies. And I'm going to run through those very quickly, and I'll share some quotes on the screen to give you a flavor of what people told me. But of course, what they said went into hours and hours of reflection and analysis, but I'm just going to give you a sense of it. First of all, goals. Many professionals believe objectives are over ambitious, that mediation sort of became this panacea to address a whole host of different problems. And the idea of this comprehensive peace agreement that really tackles those problems and brings sustainable peace, as somebody says there, an expert said that it's a kind of fantasy, that so rarely does that really achieve those results. And a sense that time frames are too short, that that actually often conflicts derive from issues which have been simmering or developing over years, if not decades, and that just to expect the resolution of those issues in months, if not just 1 or 2 years, is unrealistic. And here an example that really struck me when I was told by a very senior UN official that the Security Council itself really didn't have any expectation that this really could be achieved in the time frame they'd set, but they still made the demands of the United Nations for a swift resolution of that war. Structures. There is a great deal of concern amongst professionals that the envoy-led approach, sort of centered on one single mediator, is over-centralized, and that it isn't appropriate to handle the complexity of so many modern conflicts, and that the idea of sort of bringing just the elites of 2 sides together and dealing with each other around a table is anachronistic. Of course, there are interstate conflicts where there might be a stronger case for that kind of approach, but even there, the view that there needs to be many different channels of activity, many different ways in which mediators are working to try to generate positive results. In terms of structures, there's a great deal of concern about organizational problems. And here, as it probably won't surprise you, but a lot of concern about the United Nations, that it has become heavy, unwieldy, bureaucratic, and therefore unable to be effective in many cases. Thirdly, suitability, skills, and expertise. And here, a great deal of concern about the individuals who are appointed as mediators. And really, there you see that as it's seen as an exercise in horse trading between big powers rather than mediation expertise. And those people sometimes, given their backgrounds, which are not necessarily in mediation, that they lack the kind of emotional and social intelligence that is so vital in mediation. People concerned that even mediation expertise is variable across the field. So not just the lead mediator, but in teams that exist around mediators. And the case of Somalia, I mean, this extraordinary remark that you can see there from a UN official. How much capacity did we have for mediation? I mean, next to zero. And having worked in that mission, I can tell you that is an accurate statement. Knowledge, and again, I'm describing these as fundamentals because this isn't something that is, we're not talking about advanced or sophisticated capacities here. We're talking about just having enough knowledge to operate effectively in any given context. And here concerns that sometimes that knowledge is lacking. The case that was given of the United Nations in Libya, not really understanding the background and affiliations of individuals who are attending a dialogue. Preparation, too, sometimes seen as inadequate. Not always. Of course, in all these cases, there are always cases where people are well prepared, where there is mediation expertise. But I think these are reflections about the general state of the field and a sense that in too many cases, these criteria are not met. Method, of course, is a wide, broad subject about which a lot can be said. But let me just highlight some of the key issues that were raised in this area. First of all, that actually what is seen as being at the heart of mediation, building relationships, so that different actors, different parties develop the means to manage their differences without violence. That is sort of relegated, is subordinated to this drive to just secure the agreement, to get them to sign, which of course there's a great deal of concern that makes agreements less durable. And you can see there this emphasis from a UN envoy. You can't just force agreements on the parties. They need to own the process they're in, and they need to buy into whatever it is that they agree. And concerned that sometimes it's the mediator that is coming who thinks they know the answers, whereas really mediation is about enabling the parties to get to those answers. And of course, I'm sure there may be conflicts on your mind today, even where these factors are at play. The case of Mali was mentioned to me, where the relationship between the parties was so bad, they couldn't even sign a peace agreement, I think it was 2015, in the same room or at the same time. Other methodological issues were mentioned by interviewees. So mishandling confidentiality in some cases. Here, the concern, a former UN envoy, that it became like a kind of talk show, and that wasn't conducive to effectiveness. There's concern around the mishandling of inclusivity, and this is again a huge subject. But just to highlight a few of the concerns, some thought it had become too much of a case of ideology prevailing over effectiveness. Others concerned that it had become tokenistic and that there wasn't really substantive commitment to it. Lack of strategic thinking. And there's one very experienced scholar here saying just the number of times that they felt there was simply no strategy. And of course, a lack of the application of the mediation techniques which have been developed over many years, especially those related to constructive dialogue, interest-based problem solving, and what typically happens, professionals, is that it's big stakeholders just trying to, inverted commas, bang heads together and make it work, and the dangers that leads to short-term results. So what about then before and after? The prevention issue. And of course, here we see, and it won't surprise you, that people believe we give lip service to the importance of prevention, but that actually, when it comes down to it, there really isn't the effort and the resources devoted to it. And when the UN or other organizations engage, I mean, of course, this does not apply to everybody, but in a number of cases, it is super late, as you see in that quote there, and makes it very difficult to really mediate effectively. On implementation, there is a concern that once that agreement has been signed, the agreement that, of course, I mentioned earlier was seen as that everybody's chasing. Once it's been signed, everybody disappears. And the case of Libya there was, prominent, with one practitioner just astonished that, having been dealing with, over a dozen donors and various state representatives, suddenly they were gone once an interim agreement had been signed. And really the emphasis among professionals that it's not the finishing line, it's the starting line. The hard work begins when the agreement has been signed. Learning and development, again, just another fundamental here, and a sense that learning and development are quite variable across the field. Again, the UN comes in for criticism here. As you see, this expert saying it's not a system that's able to learn from its own successes and mistakes. A particular critique of DPA there in the UN Secretariat. And the UN is seen as having a defensive posture. How do we avoid risk? How do we avoid trouble? Rather than taking on risk and learning from previous failures. Of course, there are systematic and systemic issues which are relevant here. Won't come as a surprise to you, who are, I'm sure in many cases very familiar with this field, but that peace processes lack coordination and complementarity. And there's a UN envoy here talking about just the chaos or cacophony which sometimes swamps a conflict with so many peace-related actors operating in it. Now, of course, not everybody takes that view. There are those who think that you need a large number of actors to increase your prospects for success, but still that lack of coordination among them being seen as a problem. And a case, Colombia, before the most recent peace process, seen as being a carnival-like experience, but lacking in real substance. And a sense that the field lacks consistency in terms of standards and professionalism, and that there are people in it who really don't have genuine experience and credentials, and given the stakes, then that is not a desirable state of affairs. Finally, support. There's a sense that the funding for the sector is nowhere near enough, as well as the fact that it is often dispensed in a way that is bureaucratic, it is short-term, it doesn't allow for flexibility. In fact, we calculated that spending on peace mediation is about 0.02% of total global military expenditure. Now, I don't want to spend long on this element, but I think from those critiques, one can see the kinds of changes that are required. And I'm just going to run through these very briefly, but we don't have time to go through them in depth. But of course, they in a sense just reflect the critique, the converse of the critique. So realistic objectives, long-term timeframes, address those organizational problems, ensure that there are merit-based appointment processes, appoint people who are qualified to serve as mediators. Ensure mediation teams have mediation expertise. Ensure that teams have relevant knowledge of the societies in which they're operating. Of course, multidisciplinary nature. Methods, again, as reflecting those critiques, build relationships, promote ownership, use techniques to build trust and build buy-in, apply and work in a strategic way, and make use of proven mediation methods, and handle inclusivity in an effective and meaningful way. Invest in prevention. Don't just use the rhetoric, and ensure long-term multi-sector support in that respect. Ensure that the will and the resources are there for implementation after a peace agreement has been signed. Learn from the past and ensure sort of skills development over time, and make better use of research to close the research practice gap. Finally, on systemic issues, improve coordination between mediation actors, and then looking to improve and promote higher standards of practice. Improve areas like monitoring, evaluation, and accountability. And finally, to improve the scale of funding, but also the way in which it is provided. Now, I come to the final element of my presentation, which really reflects my takeaways on what I've presented to you, which is the views that were expressed to me by so many people in our field. And of course, I can't give justice or do justice to really the complexity and sophistication of their analysis. But I hope I've given you a flavor of it for you. But now my own takeaways, my own views. And I want to share 5 propositions. First of all, that peacemaking is in trouble. I profoundly believe in mediation. I think it, in time after time, it has made a big difference and a positive difference. And there are many people in our field who are truly committed and capable. But of course, that's different from saying it's a system that is geared to maximize progress. I think the research suggests to me that actually it is riven with organizational and operational flaws and deficiencies. And those largely, I think, have been overlooked, especially those of a fundamental character. And why is that? Well, I think it has been a very tough operating environment. And understandably, mediators have been focused outwards on the problems that the world is facing. But that perhaps has led to less emphasis on the problems, the endogenous problems, the internal problems that the field has. And in a way, there may even be a performance paradox here, but as the field struggles to make a difference in difficult circumstances, it neglects those internal problems, which makes it even harder to deliver results over the longer term. And I think this is perhaps compounded by structural disincentives for critique, because if you think about it, individuals could risk their careers, could risk the relationships they have with others if they express real critique of, let's say, of organizations, of the United Nations. Organizations themselves are struggling to generate enough funds to operate, and in a way, it's not in their interest to be totally open about the problems, the weaknesses that they may have in their organizations. States, I think, very often want to present success because they're interested in burnishing their credentials to the rest of the world. And the United Nations, as discussed earlier, tends to try to bury bad news rather than use it for positive change. So I think what you see at the end of that is that the rhetoric of peacemaking is really at odds with reality. The second proposition I would have is that the urgent priority for our field is effectiveness. I think there's been a massive amplification of goals. Consider the United Nations, which was founded for the central purpose of maintaining international peace and security. But the word mediation, which of course is really at the heart, I would argue, of peacemaking, is mentioned twice of the 14,000-word new agenda for peace that the UN has published. And well over 80% of the UN's budget is spent on matters other than international mediation. I think there's a real risk that mediation will be disused or marginalized if it's unable to deliver, especially as alternative approaches, usually centered around elite bargaining, are gaining ground. And there are daunting challenges ahead. And we all know what those are, but think of just to remind ourselves the challenges of misinformation and social media echo chambers, the impact of climate change, the pressure that will place on societies, the impact of hybrid warfare, especially in light of the expanded vulnerabilities of modern societies, the erosion of arms control in terms of the management and control of nuclear weapons and other capabilities, the new arms race based on emerging technologies, which is fully underway, great power rivalry that could pose great threats to global stability. And of course, now, especially as we see brought to the fore in light of Donald Trump's presidency, the erosion of post-war norms, which of course centered around sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the major changes we may be witnessing in the global order. So I think there's a strong case here for far-reaching, specific and systemic change. I think adaptation and innovation are vital, but they won't be enough. This is from a document called UN 2.0. This is about UN reform. And those issues there, data, innovation, digital, and so on, they're really important. But we've got to go a lot deeper and a lot wider than that, in my view. And it's going to be major specific changes reflecting the areas that I covered earlier on, and systemic changes. And those systemic changes, I think, can build on evolutional change. And really, the mediation field has changed, is changing in different ways. I think it's becoming more pragmatic. People are diversifying what they do. It is more diffuse, operating at different levels. And it is really acknowledging the role, the human dimensions of mediation and building those capacities. And of course, there's been steady professionalization. But it is a young field, and it is only, in my view, beginning to professionalize. Of course, this is an ancient practice, but in contemporary form, I think of it as a young field of activity. And I think we may want to think about the role of a professional body and the value that could have, not to create barriers to entry or entrench one given paradigm over others, but to foster and promote best practice, enable knowledge sharing and support professional development, to promote collaboration on some of the challenges I've mentioned, and to conduct policy and advocacy work, which is clearly needed to change the behavior of states and others. My fourth proposition is that we need a viable process of change. How are these changes going to be brought about? Of course, we could rely on organic change, incremental change that happens through socialization, experimentation, and so on. I think that's too slow given the scale of the challenges that we face now and will face in the future. I think we need an organized effort that has never been attempted in the modern field of mediation. Now, it's happened in other fields, and take humanitarian affairs, and one can think of the effort in the late 1980s to bring higher standards to the multitude of actors that were operating in the humanitarian assistance sector. And that resulted in the sphere standards, which tried to bring a consistency and far higher standards and better practices in terms of humanitarian assistance. In fields like peacekeeping, we've seen a number of different processes, even just within the UN itself. One can think of the Brahimi report, the Hippo report, I think sometime later, and then Action for Peacekeeping in more recent years. I think that the process will require these attributes. We're going to need rigorous self-scrutiny. I think we should embrace that. We should see identification of problems and issues as an opportunity to improve, not be afraid of it. And of course, we'll need to disaggregate data to figure out what works in what circumstances. I think we'll need a constructive debate of really diverse actors. So this just can't be just a Western exercise. It really needs to embrace the many mediation actors around the world. I think it's got to draw on related fields and disciplines, as well as bring them into the process. Of course, I'm thinking of diplomacy and peace building, and reconciliation, and transitional justice. There are so many areas that are part of a broader peacemaking endeavor. It will need leadership and organization. My view is that it can be collectively led. I think if there is the willpower there amongst the field itself. I want to finish with a final thought that I recognize that mediators have limited power, that we always, whenever we operate, need bespoke approaches adapted to the conflicts we face. And we're never assured of success. We'll always need creativity and spontaneity. We'll always need to adapt. But I don't think that's an excuse for lack of rigor in how we can improve, how we can enhance knowledge, skills, and capabilities across the field, how we can improve the prospects for progress. I think the stakes are huge here. Literally thousands, tens of thousands of lives may depend upon it. So I think there's a case for change, and that we should go about it with a real sense of urgency and commitment. That concludes my presentation.
That concludes your remarkable presentation. You know what I'm thinking here now, listening to you? This analysis was so thorough and understandable and presentable. I think we need a whole new global network or a global center for mediation practice and training. And I think you should be the leader of it. Yes, yes, yes. Oh my gosh, that was brilliant. That was really, really brilliant. Thank you, Matt, for this. There's a lot of questions. And first, let me say to the audience, we're not going to get to all of them, and I apologize for that, but maybe Matt would be willing to take some of them up with you after the seminar. But so first, someone is asking about this person is new to the field. What's the difference between peace building and peacekeeping, if there is one?
Well, let's identify three different dimensions. We've got peace building, which tends to be considered to be building relationships between different groups within society, that operates really at many levels, including at the local level. And so looking to promote better relations between communities, between what may be tribes, tribal confederations, from different civil society actors, and really building the fabric of peace right throughout society. I think that is not my specialization, but I think that is the sense that I have of that kind of work. And we can then think of international mediation as something which tends to happen at the level of the leaders or representatives of organizations or armed groups or even states who are in the midst of armed conflict in an attempt to mediate between them. Although, of course, in today's complex societies, those activities go way beyond simple mediation. Now, the difference then that I would say with peacekeeping is that this is something that tends to happen once an agreement has been reached between belligerents. Usually there will be an effort to say, well, how do we ensure that we can maintain the peace? Now, really at the core of the answer to that question should be that we've changed the relationship between the parties, really. So there shouldn't be, in an ideal circumstances, the need for peacekeeping forces. But of course, we know that relationships take time to change, and there may be actors who disagree with a peace that has been achieved between two parties. And that's when we deploy forces who may be armed, who observe the peace, and who try to protect it, as it were, and enable or people to go about their ordinary lives with a separation of the armed forces on both sides. So I hope that captures something of the differences between those three different spheres of activity.
Okay, thank you, Matt. There's a question here about the IGAD process of mediation regarding South Sudan. And what do you think about that mediation process? And it seems that the South Sudan may be on the brink of relapse into civil war. What's your take on that?
Well, I haven't worked on that particular process, but I did talk to a number of people that have. And all I will say is that there has been concern related to the point that I just made, which was whether those relationships have really changed. Mm-hmm. So have we got to the point where there is an understanding between the different parties, a recognition of the different interests and concerns and needs that they may have, and a commitment to try to work to work together that those interests, needs, and concerns on all sides are respected. And the problem, I think, with processes which don't achieve that, and where there is more pressure than encouragement and nurturing of a different way of being together, a different way of interacting. The problem is that so easily disputes can emerge. You can find spoilers emerging on different sides, people who want to undermine an agreement, or even those who were never really committed to an agreement in the first place. And there you get the risk of a relapse into war. And so I think it's, the question, obviously, as I say, I don't have direct experience of that conflict, but I think one of the takeaways, at least to the interviewees I spoke to, was we've got to be careful about rushing into agreements if they won't endure.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So this question is, I'm hearing from colleagues that we're seeing fewer mediations run by the West and more coming from the Middle East or other regions? If so, how can we transfer your learning to the countries and individuals better positioned to play the mediator role?
I think this is a great question, because the truth is, and this is discussed between mediation individuals, within organizations, within states, that much of the work that is being done is being conducted by other actors, including those new mediation actors. Some people talk about Qatar, others Turkey, the various different individuals, other certain states in Africa. Now, I think really we should see this as a positive development, that there is an appetite to bring peace, and to prevent the outbreak of war. I mean, I think we really should recognize the potential there to make a difference. I think the important thing is that, exactly as the question suggests, it's how can we work, how can we collaborate with those actors to bring to them and share with them some of the insights that have been developed over many years of research and of practice in liberal mediation. And it's not that liberal mediation has all the answers, or liberal mediation actors have all the answers, but there are insights there that could be useful. And so, and I think that the mediation actors in the West can also learn from the new or non-traditional actors, so that there can be an exchange, a learning process. And I think it's really important that that happens sooner rather than later, because everyone will benefit from that.
Everyone will. Okay, Matt, here's your next question. How do you think about the tension between the two ideas that mediation processes need to have realistic goals versus be thinking long-term? We often hear these things positioned at odds with one another. Those involved as mediators or negotiators frequently say, we just need to get an agreement to end the fighting. The other necessities of peace can be dealt with down the road. But we know they rarely do get dealt with down the road. And if they're not included in the negotiation process, how do you think about that balance between not overloading a mediation process with so many goals, but at the same time taking seriously the need for negotiations to take the long view on what's required for meaningful peace?
Yeah, and of course, that is a great question.
Kind of sums it all up, doesn't it, Matt?
It does. It does. There's a lot in there. And I would say there is no easy answer to it. But I would say that we can be aware of the risks of both approaches. We can operate being cognizant of those risks, that if we are simply just trying to cut the deal, that entails huge risks. If you're not really either changing the relationship between the parties, or at least setting in motion processes which are going to address the underlying causes of the conflict, that you really set the stage for disasters to come. So we can be aware of that. We can also be aware that if you try to do too much too soon, you will also probably fail, because the process just will not be able to withstand so much pressure, and I think, yes, one does need to be realistic about what can be achieved. I think, putting parties, already we've got to recognize that parties, when they come into a peace process, are usually taking huge risks to do so. And really, we need to support them. And I would say listen to them and see what is possible step by step, but be encouraging them to think about what needs to happen over the short term, over the medium term, over the long term, and be thinking about complementary processes, not just with the leads, but complementary processes which involved others in society, which help to ensure that it isn't that you don't just get this, a process which is purely focused at the elite level, which doesn't go deeper and address those wider dimensions of conflict. So I think it is possible. We need to just be better aware of the risks of solely focusing on one approach or the other.
Okay, thank you, Matt. This may be the last question. And again, I apologize to everyone. This one seems quite timely, this question, Matt. For better or for worse, have you thought about how artificial intelligence as a tool will assist or distort the work of mediators in promoting international peace among nations in light of AI taking over the power of human minds?
I think, AI is one of those very serious emerging challenges for the world. And of course, most obviously, to my mind, in terms of military capabilities, as well as other coercive efforts to disable the many elements of technology on which modern societies depend. And so we are profoundly vulnerable, I think, to attacks which could exploit AI capabilities. And so, on the one hand, we face those threats, and really, one can only imagine that they will increase over time. As for peacemaking, mediation, there may be opportunities to build on some of those new capabilities that AI has. Fundamentally, I think it is a human endeavor, and we will always be needing to address the human interests, needs, and concerns which help explain why people turn to violence rather than politics to solve their problems or overcome their differences. So I think it's about human beings, and that will always be, I think, central to our endeavor. But we need to be aware of the threats posed by AI, and we also need to see where there are possibilities for us to use it to advance what we do.
Well, unfortunately, Matt, we're going to have to stop it there. And I stand by my proposition that we need to create a whole new center for mediation practice, and you should be the leader of it. Okay, I just want to go on the record for that one. And I'm going to turn this over now to my colleague, Nicole Bryant. She's going to let us all know some upcoming events that are happening at PON. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you so much, Donna, and thank you, Matt. And I should say Matt yet again, because we had the pleasure of having Matt speak with a group of PON faculty in person. And actually, we've had a whole slew of in-person events this spring, which means we're a little late in planning some of our virtual events and still getting the calendars fixed. So we've put on the slide some of our upcoming events, but we're working on getting those scheduled. And a lot are actually coming out of a very recent summit that we just had about 10 days ago on AI and negotiation, where we touched on some of the themes that Matt just spoke to, including mediator bots and all kinds of things that are going to complement this field while still preserving the necessity, I believe, of that human element that Matt spoke with. So we have upcoming events. Jared Curhan, PON Executive Committee member and Vice Chair of MIT, Amy Schmitz of Ohio on arbitration and justice tech, Ron Neeson on Canada, and our PON fellows for this year will be presenting. Stay tuned as we schedule those events and many more. They will be coming up. We thank you as ever for joining us today. Big thanks to the PON staff for all that they're doing behind the scenes, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event online or in person. Thank you.